The Guatemala Genocide, also known as the Maya Genocide, refers to the systematic violence and mass killings that took place during the Guatemalan Civil War, 1960-1996. The conflict was marked by the Guatemalan government's brutal repression of the country's indigenous Maya population, resulting in atrocities that were later recognized as genocide. The genocide reached its peak during the early 1980s, particularly under the regime of General Efraín Ríos Montt, who was later convicted for his role in the mass atrocities. Guatemala's history of inequality and social unrest dates back to its colonial period under Spanish rule, during which the indigenous Maya people were marginalized and exploited. This structural inequality persisted after Guatemala gained independence in 1821, with the indigenous population remaining largely impoverished and disenfranchised. The landowning elite, primarily of European descent, controlled much of the country's wealth and resources, especially in agriculture. By the mid-20th century, Guatemala was ripe for social and political upheaval. In 1944, a democratic revolution ousted the dictator, Jorge Ubico, leading to a decade of progressive reforms under the governments of Juan José Arévalo and Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz, in particular, introduced significant land reforms aimed at redistributing land from wealthy elites and foreign corporations, like the United Fruit Company, to the country's poor peasants, many of whom were indigenous. However, Arbenz's reforms, particularly his expropriation of unused land owned by the United Fruit Company, alarmed both Guatemalan elites and the U.S. government, which viewed them as communist-leaning policies during the height of the Cold War. In 1954, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, orchestrated a coup that ousted Arbenz and installed a military dictatorship, plunging the country into decades of authoritarian rule and setting the stage for civil war. The Guatemalan Civil War officially began in 1960, when leftist guerrilla groups, including the Rebel Armed Forces, FAR, launched an insurgency against the U.S.-backed military regime. The conflict initially revolved around issues of land reform, economic inequality, and the political repression of opposition groups. The war pitted the Guatemalan government, backed by the military, against leftist guerrillas who drew significant support from the rural, impoverished, and largely indigenous population. By the mid-1970s, the Civil War intensified, and the Guatemalan government began viewing the indigenous Maya population, especially in the rural highlands, as sympathetic to or supportive of the guerrillas. This perception led to a brutal counterinsurgency campaign targeting indigenous communities, under the belief that eradicating potential guerrilla supporters would weaken the rebellion. The Guatemalan government launched Operation Sophia, a scorched-earth campaign aimed at eliminating guerrilla fighters and their support bases. However, the military's approach did not differentiate between combatants and civilians, leading to widespread human rights violations, including mass killings, rape, torture, and forced disappearances. The most infamous period of the genocide occurred between 1981 and 1983, during the regime of General Efraín Ríos Montt, who seized power in a military coup in March 1982. Ríos Montt was an evangelical Christian who framed his counterinsurgency campaign in moral and religious terms, often portraying the indigenous population as part of a communist threat. His government embarked on a systematic campaign of mass violence, particularly targeting the Maya Ixil population in the Western Highlands. The violence unleashed under Ríos Montt's rule was staggering. According to reports by the United Nations and Guatemalan human rights organizations, entire Maya villages were destroyed, their inhabitants massacred, and survivors often subjected to torture, rape, and forced displacement. The Guatemalan army and government-aligned paramilitary groups, such as the Civil Defense Patrols, PACs, were responsible for widespread atrocities, massacres, and mass killings. Military forces often attacked villages indiscriminately, killing men, women, children, and the elderly. These massacres were carried out with extreme brutality, with victims shot, hacked to death with machetes, or burned alive in their homes. One of the most notorious massacres occurred in the village of Dos Eres in 1982, where soldiers killed over 200 civilians, including women and children. Scorched-earth tactics. The army employed scorched-earth tactics, burning crops, homes, and entire villages to deprive the guerrillas of food and shelter. These tactics also aimed to force the indigenous population to flee to government-controlled model villages or refugee camps, where they could be more easily monitored. Rape and gender-based violence. Rape and sexual violence were systematically used as weapons of war. Women, particularly indigenous women, were often subjected to gang rape by soldiers and paramilitaries. Survivors were left traumatized and ostracized within their communities. Forced displacement and disappearances. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous Guatemalans were forcibly displaced, fleeing into the mountains, neighboring Mexico, or refugee camps. Many were disappeared, their whereabouts never revealed to their families, leaving a lasting legacy of grief and unresolved trauma. The Civil War continued until 1996, when a peace agreement was signed between the Guatemalan government and guerrilla forces, formally ending the 36-year conflict. By the time the war concluded, an estimated 200,000 people had been killed, with 83% of the victims being indigenous Maya. In the aftermath of the conflict, international human rights organizations and the United Nations conducted investigations into the atrocities. The UN-backed Commission for Historical Clarification, CEH, established in 1994, concluded that acts of genocide had been committed against the indigenous population, particularly during Ríos Montt's reign. The commission found that over 600 massacres had taken place, and the state had been responsible for 93% of the human rights violations committed during the war. In 2013, after years of legal battles, Efraín Ríos Montt became the first former head of state in Latin America to be convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison for his role in the atrocities committed against the Maya Ixil people. However, the conviction was short-lived, as Guatemala's constitutional court overturned the verdict just 10 days later on procedural grounds. Although Ríos Montt's retrial began in 2015, he passed away in 2018 before facing a final verdict. The Guatemala Genocide left deep scars on the country's indigenous communities, many of whom continue to live in poverty and face discrimination. The legacy of the violence has had long-lasting effects on the country's social and political fabric, with survivors and their families still seeking justice and reparations.